I'd like to make some connections of postmodernism to some of the earlier intellectual movements that we've looked at this semester in this course here. The postmoderns are a latter part of the 20th century intellectual movement, and certainly their influence in educational circles started to be felt by the time we got to the latter part of the 20th century. But it's also true to say that the postmoderns were well aware of the earlier philosophical traditions, the earlier educational traditions, and while they disagree radically and fundamentally with many or most of them, they are nonetheless also drawing on certain of those earlier traditions as well. So I want to make a few connections here. If we go to the epistemology, for example, one of the interesting things is that many of the postmoderns will describe themselves as neo-pragmatists. For example, Richard Rorty, an American postmodernist, would describe his thinking as strongly influenced by John Dewey and his pragmatism. There's a school of law called legal pragmatism that is kind of the postmodern wing of legal scholarship. And what is being drawn on is the pragmatic skepticism, and it's a radicalized skepticism that we first find in the modern world in pragmatic thinkers like John Dewey, William James, and others. At that point, there was a certain skepticism about what the pragmatists saw as the overreaching claims of the power of reason that the realist and early modern thinkers had developed here. And so the pragmatists, in more moderate form, were arguing for kind of a more chastened version of reason, so they're still relying on reason to whatever extent that it's capable of doing so. What we find, though, with the postmoderns is that they will take the skeptical arguments that the pragmatists will make and really run with them at reaching to the point that the conclusion, rather, that there is no such thing as truth that is possible. Instead, all we have are a bunch of stories that more or less seem to work, but different groups have different stories, and that's just our predicament. So there is a connection between pragmatism epistemologically and postmodernism. If we take issues of human nature, I've emphasized here the notion of determinism, that environmental determinism is a dominant understanding of how human beings come into existence. In our discussions, we've talked about behaviorism being a school of thought emphasizing the plasticity of human nature, and that if you take a human being and put it into pretty much any sort of environment that one wants, one can construct the kind of human being that one wants. What we'll find in the postmoderns is the postmoderns, in part because of the influence of behaviorists, but also in part because of the influence of Marxism. Marxism also emphasizes environmental determinism. The postmodernists are strongly advocating that as well. And in this case here, rather than it simply being the individual, right, who is the operative unit that is being operated on, the postmodernists are more likely to cast it in a group direction. The emphasis on conflict and oppression, right, that the idea of human beings, their relations not being characterized by benevolence, win-win trade, friendship, right, and so forth. A deep sense that the human condition is fundamentally flawed, that we're reaching a world that is in crisis, that we don't know what to do, that there is no God to tell us the right answer. Science can't be turned to for a right set of answers, but nonetheless we have to make choices and so forth. All of those themes and that emotional universe of darkness, conflict, and oppression being front and central to us, all of that as characteristic of postmodernism means that the postmodernists do have a strong connection to many of the existentialists. Many of the postmodern thinkers are French intellectuals, and they're the French intellectuals of the next generation after the first generation of existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. And while they will disagree with some of the existentialist themes, they nonetheless will characteristically adopt and stick with that emotional center of gravity that is existentialism. So there are strong connections then between the postmoderns and existentialism. When we turn to politics, and this is a story I'm going to be developing at greater length here, postmodernism is a highly politicized movement, and as important as the epistemological issues are, it is arguable but that for the postmoderns, politics really is the part of philosophy that's the central motor for the movement. The tradition of Marxism emphasizing a certain kind of socialism, emphasizing that we should be strictly egalitarian, emphasizing the group determinism, emphasizing the conflict between stronger and weaker. That whole way of characterizing human political dynamic, human economic dynamic, and then holding up as a regulative ideal some kind of egalitarian socialist notion. The postmodernists do draw strongly on that Marxist tradition, and so it's fair to characterize the postmodernists as, at least in that area, neo-Marxist. So one thing as a way of characterizing postmodernism's connections to earlier intellectual movements is to say that they are a hybrid movement, that what they're doing is that they are taking things from pragmatism and radicalizing them, doing the same for behaviorism, doing the same for existentialism, doing the same for Marxism, and then if we go up to the metaphysics, that what they are doing is mounting a very radical critique of both the idealist tradition that dominated in the pre-modern world and the realist tradition that dominated in the modern world, that they are then both anti-idealist and anti-realist. Okay. And then with idealism, realism, pragmatism, behaviorism, existentialism, and Marxism, we have all of the other movements, or most of all of the other movements that we have spent time on this semester. Postmodernism seeing itself as reacting fundamentally against certain of them, but incorporating certain grains of truth, or at least grains of appropriateness from certain of the others. All right, what I want to turn next to is some quotations from postmodern thinkers in their own words that emphasize various of these themes here.